We're in the last section of chapter 7, and this is an interesting section in itself. And just kind of give you my take on it. When you look from verses 25 down to verses 35, Paul gives us a lot of instructions. He says a lot of things. But what is in the back of his mind when he's saying all of this is the present distress. And he emphasizes that throughout this particular chapter. And as we noted, that he constantly says it's good to remain unmarried. And this particular section, even though he's given some instructions concerning the marriage of virgins and those that find themselves married, those that aren't married, the whole point of this is the present distress. And I think it kind of emphasizes why he was saying that there's marriage, and then there's, then there's those that, don't marry, and the benefits of both. But if you're not married, it's better off because of the present distress. And we'll talk about that a little bit more this evening. So, as a way of introduction, we saw in the first 9 verses, Paul tells how the marriage how the married is bonded together, and that they are to surrender to each other, and that the marriage is there to prevent fornications, and that these instructions were for all who were married. Then in verses 10 and 11, he gives the instructions that they are not to depart or divorce, and if it were to happen, they are to remain unmarried and be reconciled. Verses 12 through 16, those who find themselves married to an unbeliever are to live together and observe the marriage bond. However, if the unbeliever departs, the believer must not become a slave to the unbeliever to keep the marriage together. Verses 17 through 24, we see that we are to remain in whatever state we are in when we are converted. Becoming a believer does not dissolve the marriage bond. And, some people will say, well, since they were, this man and woman were married and divorced, and then one of them becomes a Christian, then he's free to marry whoever he wants to, because that marriage bond is no longer valid now that he's a Christian. And probably the best answer to that is, if a man is a thief and then he's converted and he continues to be a thief, what is he? He's a thief. So if a man or a woman divorce and he's living in adultery, he's converted and he continues to live that way, what is he? He's an adulterer. So becoming a believer does not dissolve the marriage bond. The bond is there, and he wants them to understand that. So now Paul concludes with instructions to the virgins and those who are widows. So when we look at this particular section, we see from verses 25 to 28, Paul warns of the present distress, and the decision to marry or not could be affected by it. Verses 29 through 31, Paul warns them that the present world state would soon change. In fact, it was probably in the process of changing at that particular time. Verses 32 through 35, the married is divided in caring for their spouse and caring for the Lord. The unmarried does not have this concern. And then 36 through 38, it's not wrong for a virgin to be given in marriage. It's better than to commit fornication. 39 through 40, those who are widowed can remarry, but she would be happier to remain unmarried. So that's kind of how the chapter winds up. It talks about those that are married, but he talks about the marriage for everybody. Then he talks about the marriages to unbelievers. He talks about how we are to remain in the situation in which we are when we are called into Christ. And now we're going to be talking about the unmarried and those that are virgins. He starts out by saying, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment for the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Now, when he says that the Lord, he has not been given any instructions from the Lord concerning how the virgins and the unmarried are to conduct themselves, I guess, as far as the instructions like he gave to those that are married. He hasn't had anything to say about those that were unmarried, those that have never entered into marriage itself. But I don't think Christ needed to tell Paul or give him instructions concerning those that are virgins or those that have never married. But we do understand that while they are in that state, there are certain things they cannot engage in. One of those things is they cannot engage in fornication. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18. Fornicators would not enter into heaven. That's 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 9. So those that were unmarried were not to engage in sexual misconduct. It was not necessary for the Lord to say anything else. So when Paul says, the instructions that I'm giving you, Christ has not given me anything else to say other than what he's already said. Pretty much like what he told those that were married. He said, this is what the Lord has said, and now make an application to it. So as far as those that were unmarried, this is what the Lord has said about the unmarried, and I don't think I need to add to it. So what he is going to be talking about, and he says, the Lord has allowed me to do this because in his mercy I've been made trustworthy in this decision. And while he is just telling these people the things that we're fixing to talk about, keep in mind that what Paul is saying is that it's okay to do this, to marry, and it's okay to remain unmarried, but it's better if you remain unmarried because of the situations that we're fixing to face. So what Paul is saying then, in essence, is he's telling them the instructions that that you need to do. He's showing those that are married what they are faced with, those that are unmarried what they're faced with, and he leaves the decision on what you want to do, either be married or unmarried, up to the individuals. So he says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress. That is, it's good for a man to remain as he is. So we don't know what this present distress is. Some tend to think that it's the persecutions that they were about to undergo. It may be something else. But I tend to think that Paul knew that persecutions were beginning to happen. When he wrote this letter from Ephesus, we were told that he fought with beasts at Ephesus. We saw the uprising that the people had when the silversmiths were saying that Christianity was trying to do away with their great goddess Diana. And so he was being persecuted for that. And so Paul understood that persecutions were beginning to happen. They were starting to increase in multitude. And even when he was in Corinth, the leader of the Sanhedrin drug him before Gallio, trying to get him to stop preaching Christianity. So the Jews, the Greeks that were in Corinth, they were beginning to see the effect that those who were being converted to Christ was having upon them. So he's saying the present distress is good if a man remains the way he is. That is, if a man is either married or unmarried, it's good to remain the way you are because you're going to have to deal with the situation in which you find yourself in. In verse 27, he says, are you bound to a wife? If you are, do not seek to be loosed. Now, what he's saying is that when you're beginning to face these persecutions, it's best to remain together because if you depart, go back over to verse 10, he says, to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. So he said, whatever situation you're in, that you need to remain. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. So the decision is yours. But you have to understand if you're married, you cannot abandon your wife or your family. But if you do decide to marry in this particular time that we're living in, you haven't sinned because marriage is sanctioned by God. And he says, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. I mean, that's her right if she wants to marry. But she has to understand the situation in which we're living in. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Now, he's saying that we're all going to see the trouble in the flesh. Those that are married, you're probably going to have a bigger burden because now the man has the responsibility of his wife, the responsibility of his children. So an individual that's not married, all he has to worry about is his situation. But a married man who's facing persecution, has now got to care for his wife and his children, which is a tremendous burden on him at that particular time. So he's saying that you haven't sinned if you've done these things, but understand you're going to have problems. And when he says, but I will spare you, some think that he may be saying, I'm not going to tell you what these persecutions are because it'll just make you afraid. I tend to think that he's saying, I would spare you, by saying if you're not married, you need to remain unmarried, because that would be the better situation. I would spare you if you follow my advice. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as they have none. Those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. Does anybody want to take a shot at what that's talking about? He says the time is short. These things, whatever's fixing, these present distresses are going to happen very soon. So that from now on, from this point on, you need to have this attitude. Those that have wives should have the attitude as though they had none. You see, when persecutions begin to happen, and let's say that you're taken prisoner and all of a sudden they're going to say, I'm going to poke your wife's eyes out unless you denounce the Lord. Or I'm going to slowly torture her until she can't stand up until you denounce the Lord. So what he's saying is that when the time comes, if you've got to denounce me to save your wife, you have to live your life as if you were not married. Because to deny the Christ to save your loved one is going to condemn you, because Jesus said, whoever denies me, I will deny before my Father in heaven. So even though I would hate to see my poor wife tortured to death, I would understand that when it's all said and done, her place in heaven would be guaranteed because of the persecutions that she suffered for the name of Christ. So he said, those that have wives should be as though they had none. Those that weep, though they did not weep. So you have to, what he's saying is that we have to start making these decisions or getting ourselves prepared for this type of decision. Serve Christ or abandon Christ to save your family. That's a hard choice for any man to make. That's why he says it's better if you remain unmarried, because then you won't have to make these decisions in your life. He says, are you loose from a wife? He says, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Again, he's making that analogy of separating yourself from the happiness and the sorrows of the world. Who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. These are just analogies. You use the world to sustain yourself, but not use your world to build a future for, because that may not be there for you. For he says, for the form of this world is passing away. What you're used to living in now is fixing to come to an end, and you're going to find yourself in a dire situation. Now, you wonder how severe some of these persecutions were? If you've ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs, I made it about halfway through and I just had to put the thing down. It was just horrible. What early New Testament Christians were having to go through for the name of Christ. So if you ever get the book, you need to read it, or at least before you go.
Wasn't this during the reign of Nero?
Nero was emperor at this time, and it was probably at this time the persecution started, and then they accelerated towards the end of his reign and into the next of the others. I read a little bit about his reign and how mentally messed up this guy was. And like I said, when he burned Rome, he tried to blame the Christians, and whether or not the Romans believed what he said, I think that's probably the time that these persecutions started and started getting even worse. they were bad at the time because um, Paul was beginning to experience them as he was doing his travels and preaching of the gospel. And he was saying that they're here and they're fixing to get even worse. But he would spare them if they would understand life is easier if you can just live life to yourself and serve God than having a burden of taking care of a family and worrying about their safety. So the form of this world was passing away. So what's Paul's teaching? If you marry, it's okay. If you remain unmarried, it's okay too. It's even better if you remain unmarried because of what's fixing to happen. So whatever decision you decide to make in life, you know, it's okay to go one way or the other. But just understand that when the time comes, if you're married, you're going to have to make the mental decision to serve God versus trying to save your family in this situation. It's a horrible thing to have to think about, but Paul is saying you need to think about it because it's fixing to happen. So now that you understand all of this, don't put away your wife or your husband to think that you can live separately, because you know the marriage is a union between man and woman that cannot be dissolved. So that's what Paul is saying about the first few verses here. So is everybody kind of up with me on that? Okay. Should have put all this up here before I even started talking. Now we get down to verse 32. Now he starts saying, kind of emphasizing what he just said, the importance of it, or kind of gives us the basis for that. He says, I want you to be without care. He says, but I want you to be without care. He says, I want you to be unburdened by, the burdens that you're fixing to experience. But he says, he who is unmarried carries for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's the way it should be. The husband should do what it takes to please his wife, and the wife needs to do what it takes to please her husband. She cooks, I do the dishes. She would prefer I didn't cook because the dishes probably wouldn't be able to get clean. Scorched pots and what have you. But the situation of a married family is that they care about the things of the world to take care of each other. But a person that's unmarried will think only for the things of the Lord. Now, that's not, when you look at today's society, you will think, well, the unmarried people, all they care about is themselves because they live each day to serve themselves. But that's not the way a Christian thinks. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Again, he's just re-emphasizing what he just said about the husband. She who is married will do what it takes to please her husband, just as a husband would for a wife. But the unmarried and the virgin, they care for the things of the Lord, and that's how they will live their life. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you. He doesn't want to bind them in any way. But for what it is proper, that you may, let me read that. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So he's saying that I'm not trying to restrain you in your decision one way or the other. But what I'm trying to do is inform you that you may be able to make intelligent decisions about what you need to do and what is proper for you in your life, that you will be able to serve the Lord without distraction. So again, he's re-emphasizing the importance of remaining unmarried, especially in that particular time. Now, as I've said before, the decision to marry is a tremendous decision. It's the second most important thing or decision you'll make in your life. First decision is becoming a Christian. If you don't become a Christian, you're eternally lost. If you're a person that needs to find a wife to marry or a wife to find a husband, second important decision is to marry someone that you know extremely well, know their character and know their integrity, and know that they will be there to the bitter end through the good and the bad, sickness and health, and all the stuff that you make promises to. You know, I've also always said that, you know, when a person's married and, you know, you promise to live with them till death do you part through sickness and health, that's the binding contract that you made before man and God. Now, if you say these things and then you don't follow through with them and you break your promise to someone, you pretty much lied to them. And what happens to liars in eternity? You don't go to heaven. Simple as that. So here you're already faced with adultery, you're faced with being a liar, and you're going to stand before God and try to justify yourself. Marriage is an important decision to make in life, and you need to emphasize that to your kids, to your grandkids, and to your great-grandkids, depending on how old you are. You know, emphasize marriage is not something to enter into frivolously. Now, verses 36 through 38 really is information given for the period of time in which Paul lived. And depending on what translation you look at or you're using, it can read different ways. And if you want to go back and look at it, I've got a video out on on the church's website that I did on these particular verses. But the three different views that I think are prevalent in modern day translations is that what Paul is talking about is, when he refers to the virgin, that she is the daughter that is beyond marriageable age. The one who thinks he is being dishonorable is the father, who thinks that she should be married. Second view is that the virgin is a betrothed fiance. And when you look at these translations, I don't know what gets in these guys' heads, but they don't know the difference between a virgin and a fiance and a betrothed. They get them all mixed up. And the one who thinks he is behaving improperly is the man who's engaged to her. And then you have the virgin is a young person who thinks improperly to his virginity and wishes to marry. There's a couple of translations that follow that line of thought. What I believe is this is the virgin's father who has control of her marriage. He says, but if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Again, he's emphasizing marriage is okay, but if you don't marry, it's going to be better because of the present distress. Now, if you looked at some of that preparatory material that I gave you earlier, the Greeks and the Jews, their society, the father had control over the daughter that was being married. They would make arrangements for marriage based on family, based on, at least the Greeks would be maybe marrying into a family that would get you further up the social ladder or the financial ladder. And it was a marriage out of convenience and not so much out of love. And the Jews were probably about the same way, but maybe to not that extent. But I saw one commentator quoted a passage from the Apocrypha. Anybody knows what the Apocrypha is? It was old writings that was written between the Testaments that they're not inspired, but they give us a lot of good historical and information, and kind of gives us an insight on society, how they lived during that time. So when I look at the different translations, and I go back and I read this, my view of what is being said, I think, fulfills the way they lived back then. In Ecclesiasticus, chapter 42, verses 9, it says, a daughter is a secret anxiety to her father, and worry about her keeps him awake at night. Oh, I can attest to that. When she is young, for fear she may grow too old to marry. So here he is. He's worried about, if I hold on to her too long, she's going to grow too old to marry. And when she is married, for fear her husband may divorce her. When she is a virgin, for fear she may be seduced and become pregnant in her father's house. When she has a husband, for fear she may prove unfaithful. And after marriage, for fear she may be barren. Keep close watch over a headstrong daughter, or she may give your enemies cause to gloat, making you the talk of the town, a byword among the people, shaming you in the eyes of the world. So what he's saying is that one of the concerns of the father is that she is going to reach the age to where she's not marriageable. And that's what Paul is saying here. If she has passed the flower of her youth, that is, if she reaches the age where she is not really on the market anymore, so to speak. Plato kind of gives us an idea of what they considered an old maid. Any girl that reaches 20 years of age is entering that stage of her life to where she's not really marriageable anymore. And I don't know the reason why they would marry their daughters off when they were 13, 14 years old, unless they understood that they could take a young girl and a man could mold her into the wife that he'd wanted to have, and that's kind of the way it is. An older person would fight back and say, "Listen, I'm not going to do this." But what he's saying is that if he thinks he's behaving improperly towards his virgin, that is, holding her back from marriage until she reaches past her flower of youth, and if it must be, let him do what he wishes. If it's to be that way, he has control over her, let it be that way. But if it is that she wishes to marry, he doesn't sin, let the daughter marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, that is that he's thoroughly convinced that the decision he's making for his daughter is the best decision for her, and having no necessity, that is, that she is not, crying on his shoulder saying, "I want to marry, this guy next door because he's the perfect husband, and I want to get married." If there's no necessity, and if he's convinced in his heart that the decision he makes is the right decision, and he has power of his own will, that is, that he's not wishy-washy and, I'm going to do this one day and do this the other day, and has so determined in his heart that the decision to keep her a virgin is the right decision, he does well. So then he who decides that the best decision is to give her in marriage does well. So you see, the father what he's showing here is the control the father has over the daughter. It was the society's method of making sure that the daughter is married and to the proper husband for the proper reason, and that there would be no problems in the marriage thereafter. That was the responsibility of the father. And so he had the control over the marriage of the daughter. But he who does not give her in marriage does better. So, you see, marriage, if the father decides to marry off his daughter, he does well. If he decides not to keep her as she is, and if she's content to be that way, if she's one of these people that says, I'm not going to live with a husband, I'll just soon live by myself, I can do just as well through life, then he does better. And the reason he does better is because now she finds herself in a position that she's not going to have to make hard decisions between a husband and children when the times of persecutions become. So verses 36 through 38 pretty much covers that, period of time. Any thoughts on that?
I was looking up the divorce rates. It used to be everybody always talked about how the divorce rates are. And I heard it recently, and I looked it up, and it said that the highest was in the 79 to 81. It peaked at 22 per 1,000 married women, and it said in the 80s, 60% of the marriages ended in divorce versus of the second marriage versus 50% today. And it said in 22, only 14.9% of marriages ended in divorce, the lowest in 50 years.
More people are getting married now though, too, right?
It said a lot of people are getting older and they're getting more financially stable before they get into their relationships.
And they would just soon live together, or what else they call it, one night stands. You know, that's the kind of lifestyle people looking at, are living today. And, they just look at marriage as the, you know, the ultimate option to, maybe solidify your old age. I don't know. I do know that it was bad. It's bad now, and I think it was just as bad during the time of Corinth, because we see a lot of promiscuous lifestyles that Paul describes back over in chapter 6. But to finish this up, verses 39 through 40 is another interesting little section here. He says, a wife is bound by law as long as the husband lives. We talked about that quite a bit. But if the husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now, what does that phrase mean, only in the Lord, mean? In relation to the marriage. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
Scriptural.
Christian? Scriptural? Okay. Some translations, again, this is another one of your little translation traps, will say that he must be a Christian. She can marry who she wishes as long as he's a Christian. Well, that's not what the text says. The text simply says that she can marry whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now, this is the only time that this phrase is used in the New Testament, only in the Lord. But the phrase in the Lord is used quite extensively. It talks about people who belong to Christ. It talks about doing things in the name of the Lord. And so it can encompass the acts that we do, it encompasses the people, it encompasses a lot of dealings or things in this nature. So when we look at this, my first instinct is anybody that's going to be facing the current distress that they're fixing to face, and she's going to remarry, it would make sense that she would marry a Christian. It would not be wise to marry an unbeliever, because all she's going to do is heap more trouble upon her head when those persecutions start. And Paul is saying that if she can marry whom she wishes, only in the Lord, best thing is to marry a Christian. But it does not, I think, limit her to that decision. I think that we have to view this in the situation and the time in which they live. Situations and the time that we live. If things get to the point where we're being persecuted every time we go to Walmart, it might be a good idea not to remarry someone who's not a believer. So one of the things I look at is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And Paul tells the children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Now what does he say? Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because it's the right thing to do. Is he saying, children, obey your parents as long as they're Christians? Is he saying that children, obey your parents? Children, you do not have to obey your parents if they are not Christians? You kind of see the quagmire there? So what he's saying is, in the Lord, is by his authority and by his rules and regulations. Now, another thing that comes up is that we have a widow that marries an unbeliever, and then later on down the road, she sees that this is a sin. How does she resolve the marriage? Can she put the man out? No, go back to verse 10. She's married, there's a marriage bond, you cannot put the man out, you cannot divorce him. And how do you resolve it? There's no resolution to it. You're stuck in a bond that Paul says is a sin because she married someone that was not a Christian. How do you get out of this? See the quagmire? So I kind of look at this particular verse thinking that Paul is saying, you can marry whomever you wish, only in the Lord. Realize that you are still a Christian. When persecutions come, you cannot abandon that for the sake of your unbelieving husband. If you're going to marry someone who's a Christian. To me, it's unfathomable that someone would marry someone who's not a believer, because it's going to bring hardship upon the family, irregardless. And then he says, if she remains as she is, that is unmarried, she'll be happier according to my judgment, and and I think I also have the Spirit of God. In other words, I think that he's not saying I think as though he's guessing whether or not God is saying this, but he is saying this by the divine right that he has the Spirit of God. He says, I think, I know, I also have the Spirit of God. God is with me in this. As he says, I have been found, one who is found worthy of the judgment of God, to be found trustworthy, as we started this discussion. So, when we look at this particular section of the verse, or section here, Paul says, this is marriage to believers, this is marriage to unbelievers, this is the way virgins and the unmarried need to conduct themselves, but the whole thing in a nutshell is, if you can live life unmarried, at least in this particular time of Christianity, you're going to be a lot better off, because you'll be able to serve God undistracted, and you're going to be able to endure the persecutions without having to worry about those whom you love. So in conclusion of all of this, there was a couple of things, if I can get this thing to work right. Of course, it never does. Well, let me get down here in conclusion with the right button. Paul tells how the marriage bond is to surrender to each other and to, no, that's the introduction. Well, I'll put it up here like this, and we can read it in small print. Parents should have great concern for the marriage of their children. Children should heed the advice of their parents when considering marriage. Making a decision to remain unmarried is just as important as making a decision to marry. Marriage to a Christian is far better than marrying an unbeliever. And when you do marry, choose wisely and know the integrity of the one you marry. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, one that cannot be undone if you make the wrong choice. So this is what Paul is saying in chapter 7. So when you look at a Christian's life here on earth, chapter 7 is probably the second most important chapter to understand in your life. First one is probably the chapter that tells us that we need to be baptized for the remission of our sins to enter into heaven. This one tells us how to live our life on earth with happiness that we can have. Anyway, I appreciate y'all's comments and thoughts, and we'll move on to things offered to idols. That should be another interesting chapter.